Hello, good evening.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Mahlet is having some technical challenges, but we are going to begin shortly. The program that we're going to do today is about Aliko Dangote. Basically, what we want to look at today is president of Dangote Industries Limited and the private sector, Africa's private sector. So Dangote and the African private sector and its place in the new Africa, of course, which we want. That is the topic that we are going to discuss today. So as we are talking about this, I'm waiting for Mallet to join in. It's possible that she has some technical challenges, but I think we are good. Okay, Mallet is back. All right.
All right, thank you. Thank you for taking over, Kwame. Yeah, some technical problem, but I'm back. So without further ado, welcome everyone. And yeah, today's topic is really something that we have been planning to do from a week ago. Dangote's investment in Africa and how is that fitting with the Africa we want of the Agenda 2063. So I will go ahead. So Dangote has like about 17 countries. He had his investment mainly in cement, I think 10 countries, and then the latest being in oil refinery and as well fertilizer plants, and there's also sugar, rice, and others. So now, first of all, can you I mean, I have to welcome you. Sorry, welcome, Kwame. We didn't even greet here. And yeah, can you unpack for us how Dangote's commitment into in Africa, his investment in Africa, is fitting, and with Africa's agenda as well, and yeah, in general.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mallet. Had briefly introduced the topic which we are going to discuss, which is Aliko Dangote. I think that it's very important to look at what Dangote has done, not just for Nigeria, before we can, okay, say, is he what is what he's doing benefiting the African continent, or is this the model of African private sector that we should look for, or we should look up to? Look at things like the refinery which he just completed,
Mhm.
in Nigeria, which has been working and has reached almost full capacity. And there is talk that before the end of the year, a refinery which was producing about 650,000, or which has an installed capacity of 350,000 barrels per day, is going to be increased to produce about 750,000 by the end of this year. And later on, it will be increased to become the biggest, oil refinery, which will be able to produce more than 1.4 million barrels per day. So it will be bigger than India's biggest, refinery, or the biggest, refinery in the world, which is in India, which is called Jamnagar, and is owned by Reliance Industries. One of the richest guys in India is the one who owns. So he's someone who has diversified, okay, from trading, someone who started, as a trader in Nigeria, used to import cement, used to import sugar, and all these food commodities. Later on, changed to manufacturing. Then, after starting to manufacture cement and all the other things like sugar, we saw him starting to expand to other African countries, and as you said, rightly said, right now he's in about 17 African countries, of course, including Ethiopia, where he's investing heavily. Recently, he invested about $2.5 billion in Ethiopia. He has invested in Kenya. He has invested in Tanzania. He has invested in Ghana. Ghana is completely now importing sugar, even though he has already invested in cement in Ghana. He wants to invest in sugar because Ghana is importing all its sugar from outside. They don't have even a single functioning sugar refinery. So Dangote is coming in to start producing sugar in Ghana. He has invested in Ivory Coast. He has invested in a lot of African countries. I think even when you go to the southern part of the continent. So really, you could say that, without being mistaken, that this is the model of the African, private sector that we want as Africans. We want the African private sector to stand on its own, because without, a private sector, a strong indigenous private sector, we cannot talk about the economy. And as he himself, Dangote, always says, that no one is going to come and build this continent for us. We can't say that, oh, always we are waiting for foreign investors, as we have seen on numerous, cases, in numerous, times, that uh, African heads of state go out there, and then they are asking that investors should come and invest in our country. But if you look at countries like the United States, right now they are also scouting for investments into their country. You have seen Donald Trump. Why he's using his tactics, negotiation tactics, is because he wants to, he wants to invite, or he wants to attract more investments into the country. So you want to ask a question: which African country really has any leverage compared to that of the United States when it comes to attracting investments? So at the end of the day, you find that the type of investments that are coming to the African continent from outside, actually they are just leftovers, when you talk about the global stage. So you don't find really solid investments like what Dangote has done in Nigeria. During the colonial times up to date, from the colonial times up to date, there's no single company or single country that has ever invested in Nigeria up to $20 billion. Okay, like what Dangote did, and he put $20 billion in a single refinery. There's not a single country or a single company from outside that has ever done, that what he has done. So this shows you that uh, it is the indigenous investors that we are supposed to rely on, when it comes to development. It is the indigenous private sector that we are supposed actually to build. And people like Dangote himself, of course, as we will see later on, was empowered by the government of President Obasanjo, in Nigeria. This is how he came up. So there is need for us to build up our own private sector as Africans, so that this same private sector can create not only jobs on the African continent, but also be able to go out there and invest outside so that they can bring the benefits. We hear about profit repatriation is because the foreigners come and invest in our continent, and then they take out the money, and then that is when you hear things like inflation. There's lack of dollars because it is during this period that
You are a bit
from
breaking,
there's
Kwame.
dollars. I think that, yeah. Can you hear me, Malit?
Now, yeah, but you were breaking.
Malit, can you hear me?
I hear you now. Before
Okay,
you were
yeah. So
breaking.
okay. Okay, so I think it's because of the internet. So in 2024, Dangote called actually the the African private sector leaders or business owners, major business players on the African continent, those on the continent actually and those outside. It was in September, so he invited them for a retreat actually in Kigali, which happened in Kigali, and that retreat was called the African Renaissance Retreat. And in this, actually, what he sought to achieve is to energize the players, the African private sector players. Of course, he called almost all the richest men on the African continent, the Musopes, the Patrice Musopes of South Africa. There was a white guy, Rupert, he's also of South Africa, and many others were called,
Yeah, I am also having a problem, but I think it's okay now. Are you there, Kwame? Kwame?
Yes, Malik, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, please continue. I think it might happen again, but yeah.
Can you hear me, Malik?
Yes, loud and clear for now.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I think the network is quite not very stable. But I think we'll try to move forward. Yeah.
So
So
yeah, you have
so
been
I
touching
was saying
also.
that
Yeah, finalize that and we move also on the second one. You have been touching it, I think, but that's what I was thinking to ask you.
yes, yes. I think that Dangote has already shown the way, but somehow it looks like the African heads of state have not been able to catch it, like to really understand, what is supposed to be done, to build up, the African private sector, all right, so that it can be strong because they are still hooked onto that old thinking that somebody is supposed to come from outside and build the African, continent for us, instead of propping up the indigenous, investors, or building up their own indigenous, private sector. So you see in countries like Uganda, they are bringing in foreigners to build the economy, like Indians and all these, even simple infrastructures like infrastructure infrastructure like a stadium, they are tools, to cannibalize the economy or even to cannibalize the sectors where the indigenous, people should be, taking advantage of. So I think that Dangote has really demonstrated what must be done and what should be done. So in this retreat, which he called the African Renaissance Retreat, he sought to charter a new way, a new direction through the private sector, the African private sector, the African players within the private sector, business leaders on the continent, and those in the diaspora, to think of a way. I think you can think of it uh, as some sort of 19th century gathering whereby the United States, when it was taking off, at the beginning of the 19th century, that you had leaders, business leaders in the United States, people like Andrew Carnegie, who were controlling steel. You have people like Rockefeller, who were controlling the energy sector. So actually, Dangote is the Rockefeller of our time, during this period in Africa, because Rockefeller was controlling all the energy, in the United States. Almost, he reached a point where he owned almost 7% of the United States economy. All right, as in GDP terms, he owned up to 7% of the United States economy. So you had the Carnegies, you had the Vanderbilts, who owned almost all the railway network in the United States. So I think this is something that people like Dangote sought to sort of emulate, bring together these business leaders and show them that you guys, we are supposed to build this infrastructure, whether it is communication, so that we can also be in a place where we can say, okay, we are in our 19th century in the same position where the United States was, that we are supposed to pull our resources together and build the continent. And I think that this is what he has been doing, going all over the continent, investing there, investing in fertilizer, investing in cement, because these are the resources actually you need. This is the type of manufacturing you need for a continent like ours, which is at the takeoff stage. For example, you need energy. That is number one. Like we said, Rockefeller during the United States, you need railways, which a railway, of course, has not been, built. A continental railway platform has not been, and you need communication. All right, so this has not been built, and then you need food. You have to invest a lot in food. So that is why he's investing a lot in, for example, fertilizers. So I think that he is the model. He's the right model of what, of course, unfortunately, many of the African heads of state have not yet caught on this reality, that we should empower the private sector, apart from a few of them.
Okay, so you have been talking about it. Unless you want to finalize, then I move to the next question. So yeah, Dangote himself has in his investment, for example, the latest one, the oil refinery, he has been facing a lot of challenges from his own government, from Nigeria as well. There are as he is navigating logistical ways, and then like trade barriers, there are poor infrastructures, the one you have talked about. There's also inflation as well. There are economic factors, currency depreciation in all this. So if you can unpack, if you can give us a general view of how the private sector in Africa currently operates, and how Dangote fits, into this, the current global capital system. You have been talking about what Rockefeller, and they have had an influence during their time beyond the United States or beyond the Western world. So how does it fit also into the current global capitalist system?
So, so to answer this question, I think it's important to build on the first point that we mentioned. For example, if we talk about the state or the African heads of state and how they should be helping the private sector, simply because when we go to the global stage, for example, there's many players. Different countries have their own private sector. Like, for example, if you go to the United States, the 100 biggest companies in the world, majority of them, belong to the United States. And then, of course, there's a few from Europe. And then there's some, of course, from China. China has been coming up very big. It has been building up its own, of course, private sector after, Mao, the era of Mao Zedong, whereby, capital was not that very important. Now, when we come to the African private sector, it is very difficult that because for businesses, it's very difficult for businesses, African business people, because they face numerous challenges, not only from their governments, that you find that most of the African businesses or black-owned businesses on the continent are taxed while foreigners are given, tax holidays when they come into the continent. So you find that the local businesses bear the burden. That is number one. Now, as if that is not enough, now you have the poor infrastructure within the African continent, that majority of the African businesses don't have access to the rest of the African continent, whereby you have a market of around 1.4 billion people, but because the market is not open, it has not been opened up with infrastructure, and of course, the market faces, these restrictive tariffs, across border with small nations claiming that they are protecting their economy. Then these entrepreneurs and business people don't have access to this huge market of 1.4 billion Africans, whereby it would have been easier for corporations to grow. The reason why Dangote has been able to grow very quickly in Nigeria is because it is a big country with more than 250 million people. So this has made it very easy for him to grow, within within Nigeria, and then that is where he has come from to expand. And it's the same situation when you go to the United States, that these companies grow internally before they start expanding and going out. Of course, you can talk of Facebook, Google, and all these companies. Even when you go to Nigeria, even when you go to China, is the same situation. Even when you go to India, we are seeing the same situation. You look, people like Adani, he started coming to to Africa, trying to bid on ports in Tanzania, bidding on ports in Kenya. It is after expanding, after growing. Why? Because he has access to this huge market of 1.4 billion Indians. So now in Africa, it becomes very difficult that our entrepreneurs cannot grow businesses simply because there's constraints, there's these challenges, that the market is not opened up. There's no infrastructure. There's these restrictive, hanging on to colonial borders, that people cannot, build like real multinational companies or huge companies which will be able to compete, consequently on the global stage. Now, as if that is not enough, now we have on the international stage, the African private sector faces tremendous challenges when it comes to the international stage. And you can see this with the Dangote oil refinery, for example, that the international oil companies have been trying to sabotage the Dangote oil refinery. Why? Because these refined products in Nigeria are coming from Europe. All right. Now, as if that is not enough, again, you have now the international oil companies, which sort of almost completely own Nigerian crude. The reason why Dangote has not been having access to Nigerian crude is because these companies own it. The ExxonMobil, the Shell, and all these companies, they own Nigerian crude oil. All right, they bought it out. So they take it out and sell it on the international market. So the government is helpless. In Nigeria, the government is almost like a puppet government which belongs to the international multinational oil companies. So Dangote has to fight to get even access to crude which is coming from the ground. And of course, these things are not spoken in broad daylight. They don't speak about these things, plainly, as we are speaking about them here. So apart from the fact that you have all these challenges at home, over taxation, and then poor infrastructure, that in most of the cases, Dangote has had to generate his own electricity, no infrastructure. All right, he's generating his own electricity, like for example, around 300 megawatts to run the refinery. Now he's saying that he's going to down, he's going to increase that almost to about 500 megawatts, and consequently he will increase it to 1,000 megawatts. When the refinery continues to expand up to 1.4 million barrels per day when it is producing to that point. So beyond that lack of infrastructure and persecution from our own governments with the huge taxes on the international stage, there's another persecution that the from independence, the West never wanted actually Africa to have a private sector. Okay, when they talk about private sector, actually they don't mean African private sector. When they talk about the African private sector, that let the private sector deal with this or sell everything to the private sector, what they actually mean is that you should let their companies come and buy out everything that you have. They never wanted Africa to have a real private sector. Why? Is because it would be the same situation that we are seeing in China with Huawei, that Huawei then, as the private sector, indigenous private sector of China, it became a threat to companies like Siemens of Germany, I think of Sweden, and then it became a threat to Siemens of Germany, and then Ericsson of Sweden, who are telecom manufacturers. Okay, so it became a threat. So this also, the West saw it and say that they've never wanted, actually, they've never wanted Africa to have a private sector, because this private sector, African private sector, indigenous private sector, would be a threat to their interests, that they would have now to fight and share these resources, the market itself, and of course the resources such as the raw materials. And this is the situation, of course, you are seeing in Nigeria, that you have to compete for the crude oil. They want to take the crude oil outside, and Dangote too wants it. Now, the other thing is that now you have to contest with the market. So they don't want an African private sector which will be able to compete with them on access to market. Like you are seeing right now, it is a threat. You have seen that some of the oil refineries are closing in Europe because of the Dangote oil refinery, because they don't have any market anymore where to sell, their fuel. So this has become a point of contention, that access to the crude oil and access to the market, there's competition. So they would not want, many Africans to start this kind of business, which will be competitive, even in technology, whatever it is, whether it is the railway industry, whether it's automobile manufacturing. You are seeing all these, that the more these technologies are penetrated, for example, China, is the more, Western companies like Ford and General Motors have got problems. Like, they are really facing huge problems to compete with automobile companies which have come up in China. So this is the same situation that we are seeing, that the African private sector is really facing almost a triple threat, that it is being suppressed. It cannot grow as we want it as Africans. And of course, something must be done about this particular situation.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you think that if Dangote was not that big, I mean, he's giant, that the Nigerian government will really let him buy the crude oil finally after all that hassle? I mean, it looks like we might have lost Kwame. Kwame, are you there? Yeah. So,
Yes, I'm
don't
here.
this also set a precedent that for upcoming investors, who wants to do good to the economy of their country and the region in the continent, uh, the sectors, that intersection that we have between the political system and the private sector and this corrupted system in place, how can they penetrate this? I mean, if I don't think if Aliko Dangote wasn't that, big investor, even the Nigerian government, would have not let him to do things that he asked, like buying the crude oil and other things?
So first of all, Dangote himself was created, by certain leadership, good leadership, of course, in Nigeria, and he created a couple of other, big players in Nigeria. It was deliberate. It was a deliberate effort to create this private sector, in Nigeria by the government of, President Obasanjo when he was ruling during that period. That when he came to power, he called Dangote. Dangote has been speaking about this. That President Obasanjo came and spoke to him and told him how do we, what do you need for us to stop this, importation, for example, of cement and all these other commodities. And then Dangote was able to give him ideas on what should be done. All right. And of course, that includes blocking of imports. Since you establish the manufacturing, of course, you don't block it at once. You establish manufacturing capacity within the country. And then once you attain, you know that you have the capacity to manufacture all these products, then you're supposed to block off, imports. And we are seeing this in the so-called trade war, in which the United States is blocking, Chinese vehicles from coming to the United States. Why? Is because it's trying to save its automobile industry. And we have seen all these Western countries use these tactics numerously, whether it is Britain, Netherlands, during the period when these countries were coming up, they were using all these tactics for them to bring up an indigenous, industry, to grow their own indigenous players or their own indigenous private sector. So this is really very, important, and is important to understand. So Dangote himself is a product of that, that era of, of President Obasanjo, who helped to, to bring them up. And of course, you can speak of people like Adetola. You can speak of people like Jim Ovia, who owns Zenith Bank, which has branches all over in West Africa. After growing in Nigeria, then he started opening branches within the West African region, even in Ghana. Here it is present. You can talk of UBA, Tony Elumelu, United Bank of Africa. So that one also, it was that era that it was created. The United Bank of Africa is present all over, in sub-Saharan Africa, but it started in Nigeria. So all these billionaires here in Nigeria were created actually during that period. So it takes a deliberate effort. It takes deliberate steps, instead of saying that you're going to rely on foreigners to come and build the economy for you. And that is the criticism actually which I hugely have for people like President Museveni, that instead of building up the local manufacturing, he has been relying on bringing in, Indians, and saying, oh, Indian investors, I'm going to go to India and bring the Indian investors. They know how to make money. This is the claim that he has been making, instead of empowering, the local private sector, and building your own billionaires, like what Nigeria has been doing, on the other side. And of course, what India itself has been doing, what China has been doing, what the United States has been doing, and what they're doing in Europe. All these guys are not going out there and bringing, foreigners and saying, well, let them build a private sector for us. So I think that this is very important to understand. So there is nowhere where the private sector will just come up out of nowhere, apart from, deliberate efforts by the government itself. So there has to be that, so that the intersection, it has to be in a way that we have to understand that these two, they serve each other. Okay, so the private sector, of course, in one way or another, strengthens the government and creates the jobs, but the government also has to play its role. Before the private sector, will come up, it's supposed to be nursed by the government, because it's the one which collects, of course, the revenue. The government also has the responsibility of building the infrastructure. Forget about
Yeah.
what Dangote is doing, that he has to build his own infrastructure, he has to build his own ports, he has to build the roads. And he was speaking, I was listening to him, that he was saying that he's building some roads, within the country, that the country now will have to take, to deduct it from his taxation, because he pays, is the biggest, actually Dangote is the biggest taxpayer in
Mm-hmm.
Nigeria. Surprisingly, so they are going to deduct, the roads which he's building, from the taxes. That if he's supposed to pay, for example, $100 million of taxes, then they will deduct how much he spent, for example, on a particular road. If he spent like maybe 10 million over there, then that means he's going to pay like, like $90 million, and then he's built ports, he's built a lot of things. All right. So he's kind of similar to the 19th century United States, whereby most of what they called the robber, barons, those guys, the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, they almost controlled the United States economy. They almost were doing whatever they wanted during that period, that they were building their own infrastructure. But even with that, it was not enough actually. When we talk about the real opening up of the United States had to intervene really, because these guys were much more now driven to a certain level by egotism and then making a lot of profit for themselves. The United States, in certain cases, had to intervene, for example, and break up like the Standard Oil, because Standard Oil, which belonged to Rockefeller, was stifling competition, and small companies were being crushed out of the system, and they were not competing because he had bought out almost all the assets. And then when it comes to railways, it took the United States to intervene in this situation for them to build a railway platform which connected the western part of the continent of the United States, to the eastern part, from New York and all these which are in the east, and then to the west in California and all these states. So they built a railway platform. That is when the wealth started springing up, in the United States. And of course, we can talk of also the interstate highways, which were built later on in the United States. So you can think of, I think, Dangote also within that caliber is that caliber, is that type of person who is trying to to spark up some form of industrial revolution. And the unfortunate situation is that most of our heads of state are not seeing it, that like he needs help, and we need to take advantage of the efforts that he's making. Like, for example, the retreat which he had in Rwanda. I believe that these kind of retreats should have been part of the ordinary sessions, heads of state ordinary sessions, which are normally annually at the African Union headquarters in Ethiopia, where all the heads of state are. I think this is where these guys should be called and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
where do we
Exactly.
want to go, and what major projects now should we do in the next 5 years as a continent?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you need, you guys, as a private sector? What do you need from us as a continent? We want to open up, for example, the market. We are talking about the African continent of free trade area, but we don't have infrastructure to move these goods that we are talking about that we're going to trade. I mean, you can ask the private sector and say, what do you guys need so that you can help us for the African continent? How do we raise this capital for us to double the energy output on the African continent? And we have seen dams like the the Ethiopian Grand Renaissance, Ethiopian Grand Renaissance Dam, which has been built, and the model which has been used there. Like, you consult and ask yourself questions: how do we then replicate this effort, like what Ethiopia has done with the GAD, to the rest of the continent, and build other, not just hydroelectric dams, but other systems like nuclear power plants, which should double Africa's energy output? How do we put maybe a satellite, a communication satellite, in space as Africans, so that we can cut the cost of communication all over the African continent? I think that these are the questions. How do we lay a fiber optic cable across the African continent, a very platform, and all these things? How do we food production? Okay, how do we increase the steel production? For example, we want to produce more steel because Africa is importing more than 62% of its steel, and this is not sustainable, considering that our continent is at the formative stages, whereby we need a lot of concrete. We need to pour a lot of concrete, whether it is roads, whether it is buildings. We need all these to build more So that means we are going to have to pour more concrete. Even if we are building a railway platform, we need concrete. So, and we need cement and we need steel. Definitely, we
So
need the steel.
I
If you're
think
talking
it's a
about
perfect
concrete,
time for
definitely
me
you need.
to come in. It's definitely, I agree that the ordinary summit of the presidents in Addis Ababa every February or January should be that is the right place for Aliko Dangote to give them guidance what they need to do if they're really about, or development of their countries and the continent as a whole. So on that note, let me forward that, or let me bring that question to you. What do you think now from this? The world is changing fast. What is the way forward, and what can this independent organizations, whether be it political party, media, and others, can do to amplify works like the Aliko Dangote? I mean, the same as we all are obsessed about what's happening in the Sahel states, we should be also obsessed about what Aliko Dangote is doing in the continent, because that is the thing we want, so that we bring it to the attention of our followers, and also, if possible, also to our government. So, for example, I know that you are part of the African Continental Union Party, SUP. Right, I said it right, yeah. And is there anything that, as a political party, that you are doing? Yeah, please give us a guidance on that. What is the way forward, and what is the role of SUP, if there is any?
Yeah, thank you, Mahlet. So I think that when it comes to what really must be done, uh, one of the things that we cannot shy away from, because it is hard, it is difficult, is the emphasis that must be put on the understanding that it is the political space, because you have the political space and then you have the economic space. So uh, the governments on the African continent, or a union government on the African continent, has to take center stage. Whether you like it or not, it has to lead. Okay, in Europe, it is the European Union which leads and comes up with plans of what the Europeans, want to do in the next 30 years, or 20 years or 5 years. The European Union discusses it in Parliament, and the other governments, follow. If you go to the United States, you are seeing Donald Trump is leading the way. If you go to China, they have just unleashed, or they have just outdoored the next 5 year development plan. Okay, so whether you like it or not, contrary, of course, to what the West has been saying and lying to majority of our people, and of course they have been buying it, leave it to the private sector, leave it to the private sector. The private sector has its role, but the governments, of course, have to be at the center stage. Okay, and in the case of Africa, a united African government has to be at the center stage of planning for the future of the continent. Okay, if you are talking about, if you are talking about, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, who's going to implement it if there's no union government? Who's going to really put in place the infrastructure if there's no union government? Who really is going to take this step of building all this infrastructure that is required for Africans to start trading with each other? Because there's no infrastructure, there's almost zero infrastructure, and the country level, you have some infrastructure there, but this infrastructure is not interconnected, is not continental, and you're talking about a continental trade for the continent. So how then are you going to carry out the continental government, a continental project, so that the continent can be opened up for Africa's entrepreneurs and African people. So I think that this is what the SUP, the African Continental Unity Party, is trying to present also to the African community, also that we must not shy away from these facts, from as the African Continental Unity Party, organizing, for power in country like Ghana. If you look at Ghana, where the African Continental Unity Party is completing its, registration as a fully fledged political party, whereby it will compete for power, and we can see that we will be seeking the help, of course, of other people who can support this kind of initiative. But what we are saying is that the African continent, the African private sector must be at the center, but the key infrastructure, which we have already spoken about, must be given priority if we are talking about, the continent taking off. The United States has just reached a level where it is, I think, around, if you look at the biggest economies right now, it is still the biggest with around $31 trillion. Okay. And we are saying that this is a country which has just 300 million people. It is possible, it is possible actually to build Africa to a $60 trillion economy. Very, very possible. If you listen to people like Dangote and what they are doing recently, Dangote actually said that it is possible to make Africa a heaven. Okay, so basically what it means is that it is possible for us to create jobs for all Africans, and for them to be happy. It's possible for us to build all this infrastructure that we need, because he has seen, actually, he himself, even when he was doubting himself, what he has been able to do with the refinery, that he never believed that the refinery was going to be finished, but he sees what he has been able to accomplish. So the understanding that the private sector is supposed to take its place, is supposed to take center stage in shaping the future of the continent, is very much built and embedded within, the African Continental Unity Party as an organization. That is very clear. And the understanding that we are supposed to go somewhere as a continent, also, that is very much embedded in the African Continental Unity Party. But more so, the understanding that a piece of work must be done. There's a lot of work that has to be done, during this process. And of course, that includes mobilizing the many Africans on the continent and also the diaspora, mobilizing the private sector itself, for support, because there's nothing you can do, of course, without the intelligentsia in your society, the intellectuals in your society, and of course, the available private sector, the small private sector which we have available. You need all these. So that is where the African Continental Unity Party is coming in and calling all these people that you come in and support, so that in turn, the African Continental Unity Party, if it comes to power, for example, in a country, it can provide then the space for you to take your rightful place, whereby things like taxes can be reduced, infrastructure can be provided, and protection from foreign players, for example, can be, instituted. We are talking about situations like Dangote, which we say that he faces major challenges. Like the private sector faces, African private sector faces, major challenges, like which are sort of like a triple threat. Taxes at home, lack of infrastructure, and then the foreign players. You have big players from outside. Like if you start a small technology company or social media company, like for example in Ethiopia, how are you going to fight against Facebook if you are not protected by your government, which
Yeah.
says, okay, Ethiopia has maybe more than 150 million people. Okay, if it has 150 million people, we're going to say that our social media platform, which has been created by our entrepreneurs, we are banning Facebook, we are banning Twitter. Let our people. So you give your own company space to grow. This is how WeChat grew in China, whereby they are not using, they are not using WhatsApp. This is how WeChat, grew. This is how other companies like Beidou, they are not using Google Maps. Companies like Beidou in China grew. This is how they grew. This is how all the other companies have been growing. They don't have Amazon in China. This is how Alibaba was able to grow AliExpress and all the other companies. So this is really the understanding that organizations are supposed to have. All political parties which come up on the African continent, are supposed to have. All people who come to power, all groups which come to power are supposed to have this kind of thinking that we are supposed to build our own, indigenous African, private sector, whether it is within the aerospace industry, whether it is in the automobile industry, whether it is in the manufacturing of telephones, whether it is in whatever it is that we have to manufacture. We are supposed to have that understanding from the political class that we are supposed to put at the center of our continent, at the economic center of our continent, is supposed to be our private sector as a continent, as a people.
Thanks so much, Kwame, really for that. I am sure that our viewers here also have learned a lot from it. So thank you all for tuning in. Please share the video with others to not keep information and knowledge to you. So we want to reach out to as many people as possible. And Kwame, thanks again for your time, and hopefully we will have you again. We want to have you every day, of course, but for now we said weekly, so hopefully we will see you again next week. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.